Chapter 1. Arrival at the Lantern House, November 3rd, 1894. The first letter written by lamplight. My dearest. Though I do not yet know whether I'll send these letters, I find myself compelled to write tonight, if only to quiet the hum of this unfamiliar silence. I arrived at the Lantern House just before dusk, the carriage having dropped me off at the end of a frost-bitten track, where gravel gave way to salted grass and wind-shaped pines. The sea greeted me not with a roar, but a long breath, a slow exhalation of waves curling over cold stone. The building itself is taller than I expected, a slender tower worn by wind and water, but sound. The main house sits low and broad beside it, its roofline thick with frost, chimney already whispering smoke from the stove I lit upon entry. It smells faintly of ash, salt, and beeswax. Not unpleasant. There is no one else here. The previous keeper, a man by the name of Johann, left behind a tin box of notes. I found it tucked beneath the stairs, careful observations, maintenance logs, and occasional musings written in a slanted hand. His final entry was made nearly a month ago. The handwriting is steady, but there's something resigned in the final line. The sea has taken the better part of me. Let it keep what it needs. I unpacked slowly. My books, 3 wool blankets, the tin teapot I've had since university, the small oil portrait of Mother in her garden. I placed it on the mantel, though it looks somewhat out of place next to the coils of rope and rusted instruments that hang there. Outside, a low fog crept over the cliffs like a tide of ghosts. I climbed the spiral stair to the lens room at the top of the tower. There the great lantern stood dark and still, like a sleeping eye. I will tend to it in the morning, but tonight I only stood by its frame and watched the horizon vanish in grey. No ships passed, no birds sang, and yet there was peace. There's a quiet here I've never known. Not the quiet of absence, but of presence, of things holding their breath. I've made a small supper of bread and cheese. The hearth glows, the kettle hums. I write this now at a simple desk near the window, with the sound of the sea beneath and the wind pressing gently against the pane like a cat asking to be let in. If you could see this place, you'd understand. It is not lonely exactly. It is a kind of holy stillness, something I've not felt since childhood summers spent at the edge of the woods. I wonder if I will change here. I already feel the pace of my thoughts slowing, like oars settling into rhythm on a vast, dark lake. The lantern will shine tomorrow. For now, I rest. Yours in quiet, Elliot. Chapter 2. The Keeper's Routine. November 6th, 1894. From the desk of the Lantern Keeper, Baltic coast. My dearest, today I feel the rhythm of the place beginning to thread itself into me. At first, the hours moved strangely here, not forward nor backward, but in circles. The light has its own language, and the sea its own clock. But already there is a cadence forming. The body learns, the hands remember. I rise just before dawn, when the wind still carries the night's quiet. The house is colder than I expect, and I light the stove by feel, not sight. The kettle whistles low, like a memory trying to surface. I wrap myself in a shawl and walk barefoot to the door, where I open it just wide enough to inhale the morning. Each breath here feels like a clean page. The birds begin shortly after, gulls mostly, but sometimes the quick chitter of a wren or sparrow in the dune grass. They do not sing, they observe. After tea I climb the tower, 137 steps. I counted yesterday, not in haste, but in curiosity. The spiral is narrow and the walls grow colder as one ascends. I've begun bringing a cloth to polish the brass railings each morning. It seems to appreciate the care. At the top, the lens room waits. Even unlit, it glows faintly, as though holding the memory of light. I clean the glass with vinegar and linen, and then inspect the oil stores. Johann kept them in good order. His notes are meticulous. Every entry ends with a small penciled star, as though to mark a task completed not just in duty, but in reverence. This morning I lit the lantern just as the sky paled from iron to pearl. The flame caught easily, rising tall behind the lens. There was no ceremony, only stillness. It turns slowly with the creak of age, and I find that comforting, like the slow rocking of a boat in gentle tide. By midday, I return to the house. I tidy the rooms, not out of necessity, but out of quiet pleasure. There is something profoundly grounding about folding a wool blanket or brushing dust from a windowsill. I have found a few of Johann's belongings, a cracked pipe, a scarf still carrying the scent of tobacco, a small book of sea chants written in an older dialect. I do not disturb them. They belong to the place now like the stones or the beams overhead. Lunch is usually bread, a wedge of cheese, and sometimes, if I'm lucky, a pear from the small crate that came with me. I eat near the window that faces west. The view is simply sea and sky, though occasionally a lone fishing vessel crosses the line between the two. I write each afternoon, not just these letters, but lists of birds I see, changes in cloud shape, small verses that arrive unbidden. I've begun reading again, too. Yesterday I opened Montaigne, and it was as though he had been waiting on the shelf for this very silence. The evenings come early now. By 4, the shadows stretch long. I light the oil lamps one by one, and the house becomes something else entirely. Not just shelter, but sanctuary. I dine simply. Boiled potatoes, broth, a sliver of bread. I take great care in washing the dishes. The act has become a kind of meditation. And before bed I climb the tower once more, not for duty, but for devotion. I check the lantern, steady its flame. It always feels warmer there at night, as though the light itself has learned to give back. The stars, when the sky is clear, are like holes in a velvet curtain. Tonight I saw Orion begin to rise over the sea, his belt barely above the horizon. It reminded me of a story Father once told, of sailors using stars to write letters across the sky. I find myself dreaming more vividly now. Last night, I dreamt of fields of paper, endless pages fluttering like wheat. When I walked among them, each one carried a single word in your hand. It is strange to live so far from the noise. But in the hush, things speak more clearly. The hinges creak like old men muttering. The stove hums like a grandmother in thought. Even the shadows stretch gently, like cats across the floorboards. The routine is not dull, it is holy. It is how the soul relearns to breathe. With steady hands and softened breath, Eliot. Chapter 3. The Grain and the Press. The air has warmed slightly by the time I step back into the workshop. It is still quiet, save for the dull groan of timber beams above and the rhythmic scuff of my boots across the floor. A soft golden hue settles across the room, filtered through the wavering glass of the windows. Dust glints in its path, drifting slowly, like snow suspended in syrup. The morning's preparation has left a neat stack of beechwood boards by the bench. I run my fingers along the grain, pale, steady, and fine. Each line tells its own story, silent testimony to seasons of wind and rain, to slow sunrises and the weight of snow. I press my palm flat against the surface, and for a brief moment, I feel its coolness meet the warmth of my skin. The quiet communion between craftsman and material. No rush, just the gentle understanding that something old is about to become something new. From beneath the bench, I draw out the boards for the platen press. They are solid and worn, bearing ink stains and finger marks from decades past, relics of other books, other bindings, other hands. I adjust the pressure screws slowly, methodically, until everything sits square and firm. The press creaks a little, as if stretching its joints after a long rest. Today's task is a special one, a collection of local poetry written by a widow who lives across the Danube. She visits the workshop once a month, always with a fresh basket of plums and a flask of cherry schnapps. Her words are simple but full of ache, of river winds and bread rising and memories of a husband who built ships in silence. I remove the sheets from the drying line. The ink has set well, no feathering, no blotting. I run a clean sheet of muslin over each page, then begin the folding, one sheet at a time, always along the grain. Folio, then quarto. The soft rustle of paper bends into the air like a lullaby. Outside, the wind has picked up. The window shutters knock gently, tapping out their own rhythm. A gull cries in the distance, high, brief, and gone. The sea is never far here, even in a city made of stone and song. I continue folding, stacking signatures into a tidy pile. Once the text block is prepared, I score the spine lightly with a bone folder. A strip of linen is glued along the back, strong, supple, and breathable. Then the sewing begins. The needle finds its way through the signatures, pulling the waxed thread in and out, kettle stitch after kettle stitch. The thread smells faintly of lavender oil and beeswax, the same spool I've used for years now. The rhythm is meditative. I lose myself in it. And then I pause. Because here, in the centerfold of one of the poems, the ink has bled, just slightly. A small mistake. Almost invisible, but not to me. I breathe in. I do not curse the error. I simply begin again. This, too, is part of the work. Not perfection, but presence. By the time the sewing is complete, the light has shifted again. Now it leans low and soft, brushing amber onto the workbench and the tools that line its edge. Each one carries a name in my mind. The awl, the press bar, the paring knife, like old friends with steady hands. I stand and stretch. My knees complain, just a little. I walk to the window and gaze out at the sea. There are clouds gathering now, thick and slow like rising dough. I return to the bench and run my hand across the completed text block, still warm, slightly pliable. Tomorrow it will be ready for the cover boards, but for now it must rest, as must I. I extinguish the candle with a pinch of wetted fingers. A thin curl of smoke lifts upward, spiraling into the rafters. Outside, the street remains hushed. Only the distant clatter of hooves against cobblestone reminds me that the world is still turning. Inside this small, time-worn room, it feels otherwise, as if time itself had paused to watch a man sew poems into permanence. In softness, Eliot. Chapter 4. Driftwood and Memories. The afternoon passes quietly, a gentle hush blanketing the lighthouse. Beyond the thick walls of stone and glass, the Baltic Sea breathes rhythmically, an endless cycle of swell and release. As I step onto the sand-strewn shore, my boots sink slightly into the damp surface, leaving faint imprints behind, temporary marks that the next wave will soon erase. The beach is strewn with remnants of the sea's offerings. Shells cracked open by gulls, coils of seaweed that shimmer darkly beneath the thin winter sun, and scattered fragments of driftwood bleached pale by salt and sun. I bend down, brushing my fingers along the smooth, worn surface of one particularly large piece. Its grain is clear and fine, each line etched by seasons and tides unknown. As I lift the driftwood, the wind whispers around me, sharp yet not unkind, rustling the fabric of my thick coat. The weight of the wood in my arms feels comforting, its solidity grounding me amidst the ever-changing currents. I consider how this fragment arrived here, perhaps from a shipwreck far offshore or from forests distant and unseen. Like myself, it seems to have journeyed far, carried by forces beyond its control. Returning to the lighthouse, I carry the driftwood carefully, as though holding a precious artifact. The path back is familiar yet ever-changing, the sand shifting subtly underfoot, dunes reshaped by winds each passing day. Ahead, the lighthouse stands steadfast against the horizon, its silhouette stark against the pale sky, a sentinel ever watchful. Inside, the rooms greet me with warmth. The thick walls insulate the house against the chill outside, a sanctuary from the raw edges of the northern wind. I place the driftwood near the hearth, its presence bringing a subtle sense of completeness to the space. Around me, the shadows lengthen, gently softening the corners of the room. The kitchen is bathed in amber light as I set about preparing the evening meal. Potatoes, carrots, and onions lie ready on the countertop, simple yet sustaining fare. I peel each vegetable methodically, the knife in my hand an extension of my body's rhythm. The act of cooking feels timeless, a comforting routine that stretches back through countless generations. With the vegetables prepared, I add them to the heavy iron pot simmering quietly on the stove. The scent of herbs dried from summer harvests fills the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of root vegetables. I stir gently, the spoon scraping against the bottom of the pot, releasing pockets of fragrance into the room. As the stew cooks slowly, I find my thoughts drifting, much like the wood on the beach. Memories float to the surface, gentle and persistent. I recall winter evenings of my youth, spent in the modest warmth of my parents' cottage, nestled far inland among thick, quiet forests. My mother's voice echoes softly, reciting stories passed down through our family, tales of fishermen lost at sea, brave souls who faced storms that would terrify lesser hearts. Those stories shaped my understanding of courage, painted in shades of humility rather than bravado. There was strength in perseverance, my mother often said, strength in the quiet acceptance of life's ebb and flow. I feel that strength now, as the stew bubbles gently, each moment anchored in simplicity, yet profound in its own right. Evening descends gracefully, the sky outside deepening to hues of soft violet and indigo. I light the lantern early, its golden glow spreading gently through the room. It is not yet time to ascend the tower and set the great lamp alight. But the small lantern is a companion in its own right, casting pools of warmth on wooden floorboards, polished smooth by time. Beside the hearth, the driftwood catches my eye once more, illuminated softly by flickering firelight. Its surface seems to tell stories, silent yet deeply expressive. It occurs to me that we are alike, the wood and I, weathered by our journeys, shaped by the elements and circumstances beyond our control, yet enduring and finding purpose anew. I sit quietly, a wool blanket draped across my lap, the heat from the fire seeping into my bones. From the mantelpiece above, I retrieve Johann's book of sea chants, its pages worn thin by use and age. The language is archaic, unfamiliar to modern ears, yet deeply resonant with history. I turn the pages slowly, the texture of old paper beneath my fingertips as comforting as an old friend's hand. I read softly aloud, the chant's rhythm echoing gently off the stone walls, merging with the distant murmur of waves. Each stanza speaks of longing, of homes glimpsed briefly before being swallowed again by the endless sea. The words resonate deeply within me, tapping into my own quiet yearnings, the homes we carry within us, the landscapes of memory and desire that shape our inner worlds. Setting the book aside, I stand and stretch, muscles protesting gently after a day spent mostly in quiet contemplation. I stir the stew one last time, the rich aroma filling the kitchen entirely now. I ladle a generous portion into a bowl, steam curling gently upward. At the table, I savor each spoonful, the simple meal providing nourishment far beyond the physical. As I eat, I look through the window, watching the sea gradually disappear into darkness, only the white froth of distant waves briefly catching starlight. Soon it will be time to climb the tower, to kindle the great lamp and send its reassuring beam far across the waves, guiding unseen ships safely through the night. Tonight, the ritual feels even more significant, a testament to all the small actions, each meal prepared, each driftwood gathered, that together create a life of quiet dignity and meaningful solitude. I finish my meal slowly, relishing the silence, allowing it to settle deep within me, a companion as steady as the lighthouse itself. Rising once more, I wash the bowl and spoon carefully, the water cold against my skin, a stark reminder of the frigid temperatures outside. Yet even this small discomfort feels important, grounding me firmly in the tangible reality of life in this remote corner of the world. Before ascending the tower, I take a final moment beside the fire, savoring its warmth, gathering strength from the quietude. The driftwood lies peacefully near the hearth, now seemingly part of the room, accepted into the quiet rhythm of the lighthouse keeper's existence. Finally, with the evening fully upon me, I don my heavy coat, wrap my scarf securely, and step into the cold, lantern held high. Ahead, the tower awaits, a silent invitation to fulfill the duty that gives meaning and structure to my days. As I climb the winding stairs, each step resonates gently, echoing softly in the narrow stairwell. Above, the lamp chamber awaits, ready to transform the humble flame I carry into a powerful beacon of hope and guidance. Tonight, as every night, I will stand vigil, keeping watch over the vastness of the sea, carrying forward a tradition as ancient as the waves themselves, a quiet guardian in the stillness, witness to both the fragility and enduring strength of life's endless, graceful drift. Yours, Elliot. Chapter 5, Tea and Paper Dust. By midday the light had shifted, not yet warm but no longer silver and sharp. It settled gently over the workbench, casting the wood in honeyed tones, mellowing the edges of parchment and board. Outside, the sounds of the coast rose and fell like breath, footsteps crunching frost, the soft call of gulls, the distant echo of waves curling against stone. I was at my bench, sleeves rolled up, brushing the surface of an old ledger. The paper, yellowed and brittle, flaked slightly at the corners. I handled it as though it might crumble under a careless breath. The script inside was elegant, though faint, a flowing hand shaped by discipline and ink. This particular volume, one of many I'd found in the lighthouse cellar when I first arrived, held decades of log entries, some from keepers long before me, names I'd never known, handwriting I'd come to recognize like distant relatives. They spoke of storms and passing ships, sightings of strange lights on the horizon, of repairs made by candlelight and loneliness soothed by routine. Each entry bore the weight of days long gone. I found comfort in them, in knowing that I wasn't the first to watch these shores alone, to light the lamp against the night. A soft creak came from the corner of the room as the kettle on the small iron stove let out its low whistle. I set down my brush and moved toward the heat. The hearth, though modest, glowed with quiet strength, warming the soles of my boots and the edges of my coat. I brewed a simple tea, dried chamomile, a few needles of pine, and a curl of citrus rind I'd saved from weeks ago. The scent rose immediately, clean and herbal, sweetened by memory. I poured the steaming water into a well-worn mug, the glaze cracked like ice beneath a frozen pond. The mug had been here longer than me, maybe longer than any keeper before me. I liked that. Back at the workbench, I let the tea steep while continuing to clean the old logbook. The air in the room was still, thick with the scent of parchment, ink, and smoke from the fire. My fingers worked slowly, methodically, removing grime from the spine, pressing soft cloth to the corners. The book wasn't mine, not really. None of this was. I was only a custodian of the light, of the house, of the stories etched into these walls. That thought used to unsettle me. Now it offered a kind of peace. I didn't have to own anything. I only had to care for it. After a time, I sat back and sipped my tea, eyes drifting to the window. Outside, the light had softened further. The sea was a quilt of shifting grays and greens, stitched with silver foam. From here, I could just make out the edge of the cliff where the first keeper's stone was said to lie, though I'd never found it. The lighthouse had stood for over 100 years. Some said more. No one knew for certain, and that mystery, like the sea itself, added to its gravity. It was not just a building, it was a presence, quiet, vast, and watching. I finished my tea and gathered the other logbooks. Some needed repair, their bindings fragile, their spines collapsing with age. I laid them out across the table, each one a window into another time. Flipping through them felt like drifting down a slow current. One entry caught my attention. April 3rd, 1894. Heavy fog at dusk. Heard bells from the west, though no ship appeared. Marked bearings 3 times. Sound persisted. Wind still. Fog did not lift until second watch. There was no signature, just a heavy line of ink that trailed off, as if the writer had been interrupted. I traced the words slowly. Fog was not uncommon here, nor were stories of phantom bells and lost ships. I closed the book gently. Let the stories sleep. By now the light was fading once again. The afternoon folded in on itself, and the warmth from the fire seemed more important. I tucked the logs back into their crate, slid them under the bench, and swept the parchment dust into a small pile. Every movement a ceremony, every gesture its own kind of reverence. Before I left the room, I passed the window once more. A bird darted across the frame, a gull or perhaps something smaller, its wings catching the light for a moment. The sea beyond stretched endlessly, a silent listener to my day. I paused, took a breath. In the hush of the lighthouse, where time moved differently, I found myself suspended, not past, not future, just here, with my hands smelling of paper and pine and my body warmed by tea and the slow fire. The world outside would return soon enough. Night would come, and the lamp would need lighting. But for now, there was only this: tea and paper dust, and the memory of hands that had written by candlelight, dreaming across the tides, silently. Yours. Eliot, Chapter 6. Lantern light and quiet steps. The hour was approaching, not by a clock, for I rarely glanced at it, but by the gentle pull in my chest that told me night was near. The kind of knowing that doesn't come from numbers, but from a familiarity with the rhythm of sea and sky. It was time to light the lamp. I reached for my coat hanging by the door. Its thick wool had softened with use, and the scent of salt and wood smoke lingered in its folds. The air outside the kitchen was cooler now, brushed with the scent of the tide and the first stars. I took up the lantern, still warm from the hearth, and stepped into the corridor that led to the tower. This part of the lighthouse, the spine of it, was built of solid stone, each stair worn slightly from decades of ascent. My boots met the steps with a soft thud, rising steadily in the spiral rhythm I knew so well. The lantern cast flickering light along the curved wall, illuminating patches of moss and the faint lines where salt air had seeped in. I paused halfway up to listen. The wind moaned lowly through the vents, and the creak of the ocean came up from below like a lullaby. There was something sacred in these sounds, in the silence between them. When I reached the top, the lantern's glow met the great glass room, the lamp chamber. It always took my breath, no matter how many times I came. The panes were streaked with salt, but still caught every trace of moonlight which spilled in silver lines across the floor. The great lamp sat in the center like a sleeping guardian, waiting. I set the lantern down and moved with practiced hands, checking the oil, adjusting the wick. Each gesture was deliberate, slow, like a prayer. Then I lit it. The flame flared gently, caught, and then grew, brightening, stretching, blooming into golden life. As the light grew stronger, the chamber warmed. The lamp's mirrors caught it and sent it outward, magnified, purified, aimed out into the open dark. Through the glass I could see the sea, a black stretch breathing beneath the moon, its waves catching brief glimmers as the light swept across them. Somewhere out there, far from my eyes, the lamp's reach would be noticed, perhaps not consciously, perhaps only as a subtle reassurance, a quiet knowing. You are seen. I stood beside the lamp for a while, watching it rotate. The rhythmic sound of its turning was soft and steady, like the tick of a patient clock. It soothed me, reminded me that even in this isolation there was purpose, there was service. After a time I sat on the wooden bench against the curved wall, lantern beside me. The room was warm now, humming gently with light. I let my eyes rest. When I was younger, I often imagined what it would be like to live a louder life, one filled with voices and crowded streets, busy taverns and roaring fires. I had glimpsed those places, even enjoyed them. But something in me always yearned for quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the fullness of stillness, the kind that holds you. Here I had found it. With the lamp lit and the sea breathing, I was where I was meant to be. Below, in the living quarters, the fire would be softening into coals. My mug would still hold the warmth of the last tea. The room would smell of herbs and wool, and the lingering trace of old paper. But for now I remained in the light. The lamp turned, and I turned with it, in thought, in stillness, in reverence. Not looking for meaning, only bearing witness. Yours, in peace. Eliot. Chapter 7. The Letter with No Name. Morning arrived with quiet insistence. The kind of morning that didn't demand to be seen but simply made itself known in subtle ways. The soft fade of stars, the return of gulls calling out to one another, and the way the sea changed from black to slate to soft pewter. I opened the shutters without a sound. The sky was brushed in watercolor hues of ash blue and pearl. It felt like standing inside a breath. The house still held the hush of night, but I moved through it easily. My hands remembered the rhythms. Kindling was added to the stove, the kettle filled, the chair by the hearth made ready. These weren't chores. They were old songs I knew by heart. On the table I found it, an envelope, yellowed, unsealed, with no name, no stamp, no handwriting on the outside, only a faint fold where it had been pressed under something heavier. I didn't recall seeing it the night before, but here it was, resting atop the ledger I had closed before bed. I sat down slowly. The envelope felt warm, though the house was still cold. Not warm from the stove, warm like hands had held it recently, familiar. Inside, a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. I opened it. The writing was my own. The shape of the letters, the tilt of the script, even the small ink blot on the lower right, a mark my fountain pen sometimes left when paused too long in thought. But I had no memory of writing this. I read, "You have not been forgotten. You have not been misplaced. You have not failed. You are exactly where the thread was meant to lead. You are part of the light, and the light is part of you. Let the quiet be your proof. Let the days be enough. Let the sea continue to speak. When the tide rises, and the lamp is lit, and you wonder if any of it matters, know this, it does. You do. There are ships that will never crash because of your light. There are storms that will pass more gently because you breathed calmly within them. There are others who will remember stillness because they felt it ripple from you. And when you feel alone, remember, that too is part of the call." I set the paper down, not from grief, not from fear, but from a strange fullness. Outside, the wind picked up, A gust moved through the house like a passing thought. I rose and walked to the window. The sea had shifted again, now catching the sun, no longer pewter, but silver gold, alive. I returned to the table, read the letter once more, folded it gently. There was no need to understand. Some things aren't for the mind to hold. Some messages arrive when a person is quiet enough to hear their own soul echoing back. I placed the letter inside the logbook, not as an entry, but as a bookmark, a reminder. Then I poured the tea. The day would continue. It always did. The light would change. The gulls would scatter and return. The tide would move with its own music, and I would move with it, quietly, deliberately, gratefully. Yours, Elliot. Chapter 8, Driftwood Offerings. It was the kind of afternoon the sea offered like a gift. Grey-washed skies, soft as old flannel, no wind to speak of, only the steady rhythm of low waves curling onto the shore. I pulled on my boots, still damp from the last outing, and made my way to the beach, drawn by nothing in particular. There was no task awaiting me there, no reason, really. Just a subtle nudge in my chest, the kind I've learned not to question. The path was soft underfoot, pine needles giving way to sand. Sea glass winked from the shallows. The scent of brine and kelp filled my nose, grounding and clean. I walked without hurry, my hands tucked into the folds of my coat, my thoughts as quiet as the world around me. Then I saw it. A length of driftwood smoothed by time, caught in a tangle of seaweed and foam. At first glance it was like any other, but as I approached, I noticed something. An edge carefully whittled, a faint carving barely visible along one side. Letters, or perhaps a symbol. Not recent, weathered. I crouched beside it, there was no mistaking it now. A spiral. I ran my fingers across the groove, rough and softened all at once. It was human-made, but long ago. Perhaps a sailor's mark, or a charm, or a simple act of passing time aboard a ship lost to memory. I lifted the piece of wood and turned it over. Beneath another offering, a small shell resting in a knot of old rope. Not placed, not arranged, just left. I held both in my palm and stood in the windless silence. The waves whispered nearby. The sky hung low, heavy with softness. Some days the sea offers nothing. Other days it gives back what was never asked for. I carried the wood and shell back to the lighthouse, not as treasure, not as proof, just as presence. I placed them on the shelf above the hearth beside other oddities I'd found over time. A rusted compass, a bone button, a pebble shaped like a heart. None of them held meaning, and yet each one did. They were like chapters in a book with no binding, moments the sea had released and I had received. I lit the fire, let the warmth fill the small room. Outside, the tide reached its peak and began to fall again. Inside, I leaned back in my chair, watching the flicker of flame across the grain of the wood. I thought of the spiral carved into the driftwood, its shape without end, its return to itself. Some things circle, some things stay. Some things simply pass through your hands, so that, in holding them, you remember you're alive. Gracefully yours, Elliot. Chapter 8, Driftwood Offerings. It was the kind of afternoon the sea offered like a gift. Grey-washed skies, soft as old flannel. No wind to speak of, only the steady rhythm of low waves curling onto the shore. I pulled on my boots, still damp from the last outing, and made my way to the beach, drawn by nothing in particular. There was no task awaiting me there. No reason, really. Just a subtle nudge in my chest, the kind I've learned not to question. The path was soft underfoot, pine needles giving way to sand. Sea glass winked from the shallows. The scent of brine and kelp filled my nose, grounding and clean. I walked without hurry, my hands tucked into the folds of my coat, my thoughts as quiet as the world around me. Then I saw it. A length of driftwood smoothed by time, caught in a tangle of seaweed and foam. At first glance, it was like any other. But as I approached, I noticed something. An edge carefully whittled, a faint carving barely visible along one side. Letters, or perhaps a symbol, not recent, weathered. I crouched beside it. There was no mistaking it now. A spiral. I ran my fingers across the groove, rough and softened all at once. It was human-made, but long ago. Perhaps a sailor's mark, or a charm, or a simple act of passing time aboard a ship lost to memory. I lifted the piece of wood and turned it over. Beneath, another offering, a small shell resting in a knot of old rope, not placed, not arranged, just left. I held both in my palm and stood in the windless silence. The waves whispered nearby. The sky hung low, heavy with softness. Some days the sea offers nothing. Other days it gives back what was never asked for. I carried the wood and shell back to the lighthouse, not as treasure, not as proof, just as presence. I placed them on the shelf above the hearth, beside other oddities I'd found over time. A rusted compass, a bone button, a pebble shaped like a heart. None of them held meaning, and yet each one did. They were like chapters in a book with no binding, moments the sea had released and I had received. I lit the fire, let the warmth fill the small room. Outside, the tide reached its peak and began to fall again. Inside, I leaned back in my chair, watching the flicker of flame across the grain of the wood. I thought of the spiral carved into the driftwood, its shape without end, its return to itself. Some things circle, some things stay. Some things simply pass through your hands so that, in holding them, you remember you're alive. In peace, yours, Eliot. Chapter 9, The Weight of Silence. The fog had returned. Not the kind that merely blurs the horizon, but the kind that presses close, thick, silver and still. The lighthouse was wrapped in it, as if swaddled by the sea itself. Sound changed in such weather. The cry of gulls came muted and slow, the creak of wood more profound. Even my breath felt quieter inside it. I stepped outside and the world fell away. No sky, no shore, just the pale white of everything. I could barely see my boots in the grass. The sea, only meters away, had become a memory. The world had reduced itself to a few feet in every direction. I was alone, but not in any ordinary sense. I was alone in the way a stone at the bottom of the ocean is alone. And still I felt held. There is a weight to such silence, but it is not heavy in a burdensome way. It is heavy like a wool blanket on cold skin. It demands stillness. It insists on reverence. I walked the perimeter of the lighthouse slowly. Each footstep was muffled, the dew collecting on my coat. A single droplet fell from the brim of my hat, landing on my glove. I watched it for longer than I should have. Inside, I lit the small lamp in the sitting room, though it barely pushed back the dimness. The fire had gone out, but I didn't relight it. Somehow it felt appropriate to let the stillness stay. I sat without tea, without book, without sound. Just the hush, just the wait. In this silence, thoughts rose that didn't often have room to surface. Not regrets, not quite, but moments I had filed away, faces of people I had loved, laughter that once filled kitchens, the scent of cinnamon on a December morning. I let them pass through, like ghost ships in the fog. They were not here to haunt, only to visit. Time moved differently in the silence. The hands of the clock seemed reluctant to move. I was neither waiting nor rushing, only being. Eventually, a sound, so soft I thought I imagined it, touched the edge of the quiet. A bell, faint and far away. I stood and walked to the door again. The fog had not lifted, but it had thinned, slightly. Enough for the outline of the sea to return, enough to feel the air shift. I couldn't place the bell. No ships were due, no buoys that far south. Yet there it was again. I closed my eyes and listened. 3 tones, soft, slow, even. Then nothing. The sea held its breath. So did I. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was everything. Some days the light we offer is not to guide others, but to remind ourselves that we still burn. I returned inside, lit the fire, made tea, and waited, not for answers, but simply for the fog to lift. In peace, yours, Elliot. Chapter 10. The Night the Stars Returned. It began with stillness. The kind of stillness that comes after a storm, when the wind no longer speaks and the waves remember how to breathe gently. The lighthouse had groaned and trembled through the previous night, shutters clattering, waves slamming the rocks with wild intention. But now, all was quiet. I stepped outside just after dusk. The sky was beginning to clear, not completely, not yet, but the thick cover of clouds that had lingered for days was thinning at the edges. And with that break, something returned. Light. Not the kind I tended every night, not the lamp or the fire or the glow of a lantern, but starlight. At first, just a few, pale, tentative, then more, spilling in from behind the veil, bold and silver and trembling. Stars layered upon stars, each one pulsing with a kind of ancient music I couldn't hear, but could feel. It had been so long since the stars were visible, I felt like I was seeing them for the first time. I stood in the field behind the lighthouse, boots in the damp grass, coat pulled tightly across my chest, and looked up until my neck ached. I didn't care. I would have stayed like that for hours, rooted like one of the stones in the hill. Something in me opened. The stars do that. They make you remember how vast it all is, how brief we are, how precious. And yet, in that brevity, we shine. I stayed out until the cold moved too deeply into my bones. Even then, I lingered at the door, watching the sky, hesitant to close myself away from it. Inside, the fire was still warm. I stirred it gently, added a small log, then sat in the dimness without lighting the lantern. I wanted only the starlight. It streamed in through the window, soft and slanted, casting pale shadows on the floor. The air felt clearer, sharper, edged in something holy. I sat with it. I breathed it in. Later, I opened the logbook, not the official one, but the personal one I kept tucked beneath the shelf. I wrote, "Tonight, the stars returned, not just to the sky, but to something in me I had forgotten. There is no need to understand this, only to witness it, only to remember that in the silence, the sky always holds its place, even when we cannot see it." I closed the book and left it there. The lighthouse lamp turned, and somewhere the stars turned with it. Yours truly, in peace, Elliot. Chapter 11. The Visitor. I had grown used to the rhythm of solitude, to the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but full. So when the knock came, I wasn't sure it was real. It was soft. Once, then again. I set down the cloth I had been using to polish the brass lantern base and stood. My knees popped, my breath caught. The sound hadn't come from memory. It was real. A third knock. I opened the door. There, standing in the blue-gray morning light, was a young woman. Her coat was too thin for the season, and her eyes, wide and uncertain, held something old. Not in age, but in weight. She carried a canvas bag slung across one shoulder and a folded map in her hand. "Is this the place with the light?" she asked. I nodded. She stepped inside. We didn't speak for some time. I made tea. She sat near the hearth, hands outstretched toward the fire, her fingertips trembling slightly. I could see the road on her, mud at the hem of her trousers, a blister on one heel, the way she leaned as though she hadn't stopped walking for days. Eventually she said, "I didn't know where else to go." I didn't ask what had brought her. You don't always need to know a person's whole story to offer them warmth. Sometimes it is enough that they arrive. She noticed the shelf of items, driftwood, bone buttons, sea glass. "You collect things," she said. "They find me," I replied. She smiled, and for the first time, I saw the softness behind her fatigue. That evening we lit the lamp together. I showed her how to check the oil, adjust the wick, clean the mirrors. Her hands were unsure but steady. When the flame caught and grew, she let out a breath that sounded like something being released. Not relief, not quite, but the space just before it. We stood there side by side, watching the light sweep across the sea. "You live here alone?" she asked. I looked at the turning lamp. "Not really," I said. She stayed the night. In the morning she left without ceremony. No long goodbyes. Just a cup of tea, a final look at the ocean, and a quiet thank you. She took nothing, left nothing, except maybe a bit of herself. And in her place, she left something else too, a pair of footprints by the door, a warmth in the room that lingered longer than the fire, and a sense that even in stillness, the world is always arriving. In grace, yours, Elliot. Chapter 12. The Lamp That Didn't Light. It was near evening when I noticed the fault. The lamp hadn't turned. I had gone through the ritual as always, climbing the tower, checking the wick, cleaning the mirrors, lighting the flame. But after I descended, something didn't sit right, a pause inside me, a knowing. I returned to the top and stood in the chamber. The flame burned, but the great lens stood still, unmoving. Its silence was not the quiet I was used to. It was the silence of something missing. I set down my lantern and knelt beside the mechanism. A small spring, aged and rusted through, had given way. A piece no bigger than a thumbnail, and yet it had stilled the whole. There was no spasm of panic, only a quiet grief. Not because the lamp had failed, but because I hadn't noticed sooner. The sea had gone without its signal for nearly an hour. I thought of the ships, the captains, the wandering eyes scanning for reassurance in the dark. I whispered an apology into the room. It wasn't for anyone in particular. It was for the dark. I worked with care, replacing the spring from an old stash of parts kept wrapped in oiled cloth. My hands knew the motions. The lantern cast its flickering light onto the curved glass, the brass tools, the notebook where I recorded each repair. Eventually the lens turned, slowly, then with steadiness. The light began its sweep once again. I sat on the floor back against the cold wall. The relief was subtle, not the flood of a burden lifted, but the quiet return of alignment. Not all failures shout. Some arrive gently on soft feet, unnoticed until you feel their absence. That night I kept watch longer than usual. I made no tea, I did not read. I sat in the turning light, letting it pass over me again and again like a tide, like forgiveness. There are nights when we are reminded that care is not a one-time act, that tending to light is daily work, that even silence must be listened to, and so I did. I listened to the flame, to the turning lens, to the sound of the sea forgiving me. Yours, always, Elliot. Chapter 13. The Letter That Was Never Sent. The storm returned in the early hours, quiet at first, a murmur on the horizon, then full-throated, rattling the shutters and pressing salt against the windows like a warning. I lit the small lantern on the table and pulled my wool shawl tighter, though it wasn't cold. There are storms that ask you to prepare, and there are storms that ask you to remember. This was the latter. I pulled out the drawer from the desk near the hearth. Behind the loose parchment and spare graphite sticks, I reached for a thin bundle bound with string. Letters. Never sent. Some were dated, some were not. Some had names written across the top, names of people I hadn't spoken aloud in years. A few had no address at all. I selected one, chosen not by reason, but by instinct. I unfolded it slowly. The ink was smudged near the edges, but the words remained. Dear, I never wrote to say I forgave you. I never wrote to say it wasn't your fault. I never wrote to say that I was scared too, but I think you knew. And if not, then let this letter be the knowing. Let this silence be the sound of peace. There was more, but I stopped there. The storm had picked up now, wind curling around the chimney like a hand trying to find its grip. The flame of the lantern quivered but held. I folded the letter and held it to my chest. Sometimes we write not to send, but to release. Sometimes we keep things not to remember, but to soften. I placed the letter back into the bundle and tied it once again. The string frayed slightly at the edges, but it held. I returned the drawer, stoked the fire. In the distance, thunder moved across the sea like slow drums. Not a threat. A presence. Something ancient and aware. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the rain trace stories on the glass. Each rivulet its own path, sliding past the others without collision. It felt like the past was moving that way too. Not gone, but gentler. And maybe that was enough. In warmth, yours, Elliot. Chapter 14. The Mending Shelf. It began with a nail, bent slightly at the tip, rusted near the head. I found it while dusting the shelf near the back door, a shelf I hadn't tended to in some time. It sagged slightly in the middle, one bracket loose. I touched it, and it wobbled. I made a note to fix it, but instead of reaching for the hammer, I sat down. Something about the shelf stopped me, not the wood or the weight of it, but what it held. Mismatched objects, a wooden spoon with a burn mark across the handle, a tin box of buttons, a smooth black stone I'd once mistaken for coal. Things I never used, things I never threw away. I ran my hand along the shelf's edge. The nail poked gently at my fingertip, reminding me that even the smallest things will eventually ask for your attention. Later that afternoon, I brought out the small box of tools. The hammer was cool in my hand, its weight familiar. I worked quietly, aligning the bracket, driving the new nail in at a slow, steady rhythm. The sound echoed in the stillness, soft, not jarring. When it was done, the shelf stood firm again, subtle but sure. I returned the items one by one, pausing over each. The tin of buttons had once belonged to my mother. I opened it. The scent of old metal and lavender sachets lingered. Inside, a note I'd forgotten. Keep what you cannot replace. I smiled. The spoon had come from a neighbor, long gone now. The stone I'd carried in my coat pocket for years before realizing I'd stopped reaching for it. And still, I kept it. We all have a shelf like this, invisible to others. A place where we keep what held us once, what held memory, what held us together, not out of sentimentality, but because some part of us knows. We are made from the ordinary things we choose to keep. When I finished, I stood back and looked at the shelf. It was no straighter than it had been years ago, but it was mended, and that was enough. That night, as the wind rose again, I heard the shelf creak slightly, not in protest, but like an old friend settling into its place, like something that had remembered how to carry its own weight, gracefully. Yours, Elliot. Chapter 15. The light beneath the floorboards. The creak had always been there, a soft groan near the eastern wall of the sitting room, just beneath the window. I'd stepped over it so many times it had become part of the rhythm of the room, like the way the kettle clicked before it hissed, like the sigh the lamp gave before its flame caught. But on this particular morning, the sound felt different. Not louder, not urgent, just expectant. I knelt by the baseboard and pressed gently against the plank. It shifted, more than usual. There was a seam I hadn't noticed before, fine and dust-lined. I fetched the flat iron tool I used for tightening hinges and slowly, carefully, pried the board up. Beneath it, space. Not deep. A shallow pocket between joists where dust had gathered in lazy swirls. And something else. A small tin lantern, tarnished and soot-marked, with a cracked glass pane and no wick. I lifted it gently as if it might crumble. It was light, like it had been forgotten for decades. Perhaps it had. I held it to the window. The sun caught the glass and something shimmered within. A sliver of paper folded tightly and tucked behind the lens. I opened it slowly. The words inside were few. Even the smallest lights remember how to glow. There was no signature, no date, only the message. I stood there for some time, holding the lantern in one hand and the paper in the other, until the sun shifted far enough to throw light directly onto the floorboards. I replaced the plank, gently, firmly. The creak was still there, but now it sounded like something exhaling, like a secret finally spoken. I set the little lantern on the shelf beside my tools. I didn't clean it. I didn't polish the glass. I let it remain as I'd found it. Because sometimes what's hidden doesn't want to be changed. Only seen. Later, as evening pressed in, I found myself glancing at that old lantern again. Not with questions, not with need, but with recognition. Something in me had been waiting to be remembered too, and that was light enough. In gentleness. Yours, Elliot. Chapter 16. The day the wind stopped. It was the stillness that woke me. Not a sound, not a gust, not even the distant sigh of sea meeting shore. The kind of stillness that makes your ears strain for what isn't there. I sat up slowly, the blanket falling to my lap, and listened. Nothing. No gulls. No creaking wood. No rustle of grasses against the stone walls. The wind had stopped. I stepped outside. The sky was pale and clear, stretched taut like canvas over a frame. The ocean lay flat, not glassy, but matte, its texture softened as if someone had painted over its waves in one gentle stroke. The lighthouse stood in it like punctuation. I walked the perimeter. Even the seaweed on the rocks looked stunned, suspended mid-motion. My footsteps felt too loud, though I moved slowly. There was a reverence to this silence I didn't want to disturb. Back inside, I let the door close without a latch. The house felt different too, as if it had exhaled, as if all the timbers had agreed to be still for a while. I made tea, the sound of the kettle suddenly enormous, the pouring of water thunderous, every small movement an event. I carried the mug to the chair by the window and sat down, and I waited. Not for the wind to return, but for what the silence might say. I'd always known wind as voice, playful, warning, wild, insistent. But in its absence something else emerged, a softness beneath all sound, a presence that was less like weather and more like listening itself. The tea cooled slowly. The light shifted slowly. Even the shadows took their time, and I let myself be. No tasks, no plans, just presence. It was not until nightfall that the first breeze returned, a whisper at the windowsill, the faintest movement in the grasses. I stood at the door and breathed it in. Not relief, not excitement, just gratitude. For the day the wind had stopped, and for all that had spoken in its silence, in silence. Yours, Elliot. Chapter 17. The Book Without Pages. There was a cupboard behind the stove I seldom opened, not from neglect, just habit. It had held old tins and kitchen cloths once, and I'd never found a reason to return. But on this particular morning, as the sky drizzled gently and the fire crackled low, I felt drawn to it. I set down my tea, wiped my hands on a towel, and opened the door. Inside, among a few forgotten jars of herbs, was a book, wrapped in cloth, tied with twine. It was heavier than expected. I brought it to the table, untied the string, and unfolded the fabric. The book had no title. Its cover was worn leather, faded to the color of driftwood. The edges curled slightly, as if resisting time. But when I opened it, there were no pages, only a hollow center. I stared for a long moment, half expecting to find something hidden inside. A letter, a trinket, a key. But there was nothing, only the shape of absence, only space. I ran my fingers along the inside edges. They were smooth, carefully hollowed, not torn, as though someone had made this emptiness on purpose. I closed the cover and sat with it. Some part of me had the sense this wasn't a mistake, that this book was not broken. It was waiting, not for pages, but for presence, for whatever stories might rise in silence, for the ones too subtle to write down. I placed the book on the shelf beside the window, let it rest there, as a reminder that not all vessels are meant to be filled. Some are meant to hold the shape of what could be. Later, as the rain tapered off, a break in the clouds let sunlight in across the floorboards. It stretched toward the hollow book, resting there like a quiet invitation. I didn't write. I didn't speak. But something in me answered. In. Yours. Chapter 18. The Day the Oil Ran Out. It was bound to happen eventually. I'd rationed carefully, always aware of the weight in the tin, the way the oil moved when shifted. But on this evening, after the flame sputtered and dimmed, I checked the reserve and found it dry. No oil, no lamp, no light. The sea would have to go without its signal for a night. I stood in the tower longer than I needed to, as though staring into the lantern would change its truth. But it remained quiet, unlit. A glass eye closed. I descended slowly. There was no backup shipment coming, no emergency flare, no contingency for this kind of absence, only stillness, only night. I made tea and sat by the hearth. The fire at least still burned. Outside, the sea was wrapped in shadow. The stars, which had been bold the night before, were now hidden behind a thick veil of cloud. I thought of the ships, of sailors scanning the horizon for a light that wasn't there. I whispered again, "I'm sorry." But the house didn't feel disappointed, and the sea didn't feel angry. Everything just was. Sometimes even the most faithful flame goes dark, and maybe that too is part of the keeping. I sat there until my tea cooled, until the fire lowered itself into red coals, until I could feel that I hadn't failed. I had simply paused. The lamp would light again tomorrow. I would walk into the village, speak with the man who knew where the good oil was kept. I would carry it back across the hill, warm against my side, and refill the reservoir. But tonight there was only shadow, only the breath of the sea against the rocks, only the memory of light. and the knowledge that even when we are not shining, we are still keepers of the flame. Gracefully, yours, Elliot. Chapter 18. The Keeper's Lantern. I had never thought of myself as a keeper. Not really. I tended the lamp, I swept the floors. I made the tea and mended the hinges. But the word keeper had always felt too grand for the quiet things I did. Until that morning. It began with a knock, not at the door, but on the glass. I was in the tower, polishing the interior of the lamp housing, when a shape passed by the window, fast and low, followed by a soft thud. I descended quickly and stepped outside. At the base of the lighthouse, half cradled in the long grasses, was a bird, small, black and gray with wings tucked in awkwardly. I knelt beside it. It didn't flinch when I reached out. Its eyes were open, blinking, alive. I wrapped it gently in a cloth and carried it inside. I'd never mended a wing before. I wasn't sure if I even could, but I knew what to do when something small and frightened found its way to me. I set the bird in a shallow box with bits of wool and soft paper, gave it quiet, warmth, a thimble of water. Over the next few days I checked on it often, spoke to it in low tones. Let it sleep in the quiet corner near the hearth, where the lamp glow never reached too bright, and slowly it healed. I never gave it a name. That felt unnecessary. Some things aren't meant to be owned by language. One morning I found the box empty. The cloth rustled slightly, but the bird was gone. I walked outside. There on the edge of the old wooden railing it stood, upright, wings stretched once, then again. It looked at me, then it left. No flourish, no sound, just flight. I watched it disappear over the sea, its small shape becoming part of the sky. And in that moment, something in me understood. Keeping is not about holding on. It is about caring until something is ready to go, and then letting it. I returned inside and lit the small lantern on the shelf. Let it burn through the morning. Not as ritual, not even as memory, but as witness. Because maybe that's all I ever was, not just a keeper of the light, but a keeper of what passed through it. Yours, truly, Elliot. Chapter 19. A Note in the Rocks. It was late afternoon when I took my walk down to the shore, not for driftwood, not for sea glass, just for the sound of the sea, a voice that had over the years become more familiar to me than my own. The tide was receding. Wet sand reflected the pale sky like a mirror left out in the rain. My boots left faint prints behind me, quickly softened by the wind. Then I saw it. Near the line where the seaweed ends and the rock pools begin, a small stack of stones, 4, maybe 5, balanced, but not artfully. More like someone had done it with intention, but not with flourish. At first, I thought it was just one of those odd things the ocean arranges. But as I knelt beside it, I noticed something. A scrap of paper, folded and tucked between 2 stones. I hesitated, then unfolded it. There were only 6 words. You are not waiting for nothing. No name, no date, just the message. The wind lifted the edges of the paper, urging me to fold it again. I stood and looked around. No footprints nearby, no figures in the distance, only the sea and the light beginning to lean. I placed the note back where I found it, pressing the stones gently to keep it in place. It didn't feel like it was meant to be taken, just found. Back at the lighthouse, I sat near the window and watched the sun dip low, turning the tide line to gold. My hands were still sandy, but I didn't brush them clean. That sentence stayed with me. You are not waiting for nothing. It didn't say what I was waiting for, or how long it would take. or whether I'd recognize it when it came. Only that something was coming, and that I was not foolish for feeling it. Sometimes even the sea leaves notes, and sometimes all we have to do is kneel beside them and listen. Gracefully yours, Elliot. Chapter 20. The lamp will outlive me. There are days I wonder how long I'll stay, not out of restlessness, not from loneliness, but because I can feel the lighthouse growing older in me, not fading, just settling, like an old coat you keep wearing until it becomes the shape of your body. This morning, as I climbed the tower to light the lamp, my knees ached more than usual. My hand trembled slightly as I struck the match, and still I smiled, because the flame caught, because the lens turned, because the sea was there to receive it. I think often about the first keeper and the one before me. We are part of something longer than memory, a chain of caretakers, each one lighting the same lamp with hands shaped by different decades. One day, someone else will climb these stairs. They'll learn which step creaks loudest. They'll know where the kettle fits best on the stove. They'll find my small notes in the margins of the logbook. They may never know my name, but they will know the quiet rhythm I've tended. They'll feel it in the way the wind speaks through the cracks. They'll smell it in the firewood. They'll know without knowing what it means to keep a light alive. And that will be enough. I've started writing down small instructions, not because they'll need them, but because I love this place. And love always wants to leave something behind. Tonight, as the lamp sweeps across the dark sea once more, I sit with a deeper stillness. Not sorrow, not fear, just the understanding that I am a chapter in a longer story. And this light will outlive me, as it should, as it was meant to. And may whoever comes next feel what I've felt, and add their own silence to the turning of the lamp in peace. Yours, Elliot. Chapter 21. The map in the floorboards. The storm had passed 2 nights ago, but its scent still lingered. Salt, pine sap, and the faint mineral tang of lightning that had split the sky and driven itself into the earth. The lighthouse stood unshaken, but something in me had been stirred, unsettled in a way I couldn't name. I had slept poorly since, waking at odd hours, hearing phantom creaks in the walls that didn't match the old rhythm I'd come to trust. By mid-morning, I had decided to clean, not out of necessity, but to settle my nerves. There's something calming in the friction of brush against floor, in the steady order of returning objects to their places, a kind of embodied silence. I moved the small rug from the sitting room, the one I rarely disturbed, and swept beneath it. Dust had gathered, as expected, but beneath the grime, something else caught the light. A seam, a hairline split in the wood I hadn't noticed before. I knelt, brushed away the rest of the dust with my sleeve. The seam became clearer, rectangular, about the length of a book. I fetched the lantern, not for light, but for comfort, and placed it beside me. The small metal hook I used to clean the hearth was thin enough to pry the edge. The board gave with a reluctant groan. Inside a hollow space, not deep, just enough room for a wrapped bundle tied with twine. I didn't rush. I sat for a while first, staring at it. You live with a place long enough and you begin to believe you know its every whisper, every groan and shift. But there is always something hidden. I untied the twine. Inside the bundle was a thick piece of parchment, creased, yellowed and soft from age, a map. Not one made by cartographers or for travelers, but something personal. A hand-drawn chart. The coastline was familiar, the curve of the headland, the scatter of small islands beyond the southern shoals. But this was no navigational aid. There were symbols marked in places no sailor would venture. A spiral on the northern cliffs. A tree etched in ink near the mouth of the freshwater stream. A series of dots trailing into the forest. And in the center, where the lighthouse would be, a circle, not filled, but haloed. At the bottom, just above the worn edge, a word had been inked in delicate, careful script. Remember. The script didn't match the logbooks, nor the ledgers of any past keeper I'd read. And yet, it felt familiar, as if it belonged to someone I had never met, but had always known. I laid the map flat on the table and studied it as I drank my tea. The symbols made no practical sense, but they stirred something, an ache that wasn't pain, a pull towards something half forgotten, as if the land itself was asking to be seen in a different way. That afternoon I walked the trail past the headland. The sun was thin, its light filtered through the gauze of low clouds. I followed the coast as it curved gently southward, the way marked by ancient pines and the hush of wind weaving between them. There were no paths marked on the map, but I wasn't looking for roads. I was looking for impressions. Near the edge of the cliffs, I found the spiral. Carved into the stone, weathered nearly smooth but still visible if you knew to look. It matched the symbol on the map precisely. I stood before it for a long while. Not because I expected a revelation, but because something in me felt recognized. I continued down to the freshwater stream and found the tree, twisted, wide-rooted, with bark like ancient parchment. Beneath it, the ground had been disturbed in the distant past. No signs of a grave, no marker, just a quiet hollow, like the land had once been lifted and lowered again. I followed the dots inland, across moss-covered stones and under low-hanging branches, until I reached a clearing I had never seen. In the center stood a stack of stones, 5, balanced delicately. Not high, not grand, but intentional. Someone had come before me. Someone had mapped this place not with direction, but with meaning. By the time I returned, dusk was already folding itself into the corners of the land. The lamp would need tending soon, and the sky had begun its deep blue drift into night. Inside, I placed the map beneath the lantern on the table, letting its corners curl gently in the fire-warmed air. I didn't know who had drawn it, or why, but I knew it wasn't meant to be solved. It was meant to be remembered, not with the mind, but with the body, with the breath, with the kind of silence that doesn't answer questions, but makes them beautiful. That night I climbed the tower slowly, lit the lamp with a reverence I hadn't known I'd lost. As the light turned, I watched it trace the path of the same sea marked on the map, the same water that carried ships and dreams and driftwood and voices. And I understood something without needing to speak it. This place had been mapped long before me, not for navigation, but for return, for remembering, for finding not a way out, but a way in. I left the floorboard open, just a little, yours. Always, Elliot. Chapter 22, The Window Facing West. It was the window I rarely opened, not for any bad reason, not because of a memory or a draft. It simply faced the direction I spent the least time watching. Most evenings, I walked the eastern cliffside. Most mornings, I stood facing north, watching the sea for signs. But west was where the day ended, and I had always found that difficult to look at directly. Until that evening. I was dusting the shelves, an act of rhythm more than necessity, when the light shifted. Not just the quality of it, but the direction. A soft gold moved across the floor, warmer and deeper than I was used to at that hour. It touched the stones like honey, touched my hands like forgiveness. I turned. The western window had caught the sun. I walked to it, slowly, as if approaching something sacred. The glass was slightly mottled with age, the frame rough from salt air. But the view was unlike anything I had seen from this house before. The sun hovered just above the horizon, low and immense, a molten sphere suspended in breath. The sea, that endless companion, reflected it not in mirror but in mosaic, each wave a tile of fire and shadow. For the first time in years, I opened the window. The hinges resisted, then sighed, and in poured the wind, not cold but sure. Carried on it was the scent of pine resin, of drying seaweed, and the faint trace of wood smoke from a cottage far inland. It was the scent of things letting go, the scent of day giving itself to dusk. I stood at the window for a long while, and I remembered. A time when someone I loved had watched sunsets the way others watched stars. Patiently, reverently, as if they contained secrets no one else had earned. I remembered her voice, soft but certain, saying, "It's not an ending, you know. It's a folding, like a note you tuck into a pocket for later." I had forgotten that. How much else had I folded and tucked away, never unfolding again? The room behind me darkened, but I stayed at the window. The lighthouse lamp would need to be lit soon, but I let the task wait a few more moments. The sun dipped, slowly, then all at once. Its final light spilled across the water, turning the tide into amber, into memory. When the last of it disappeared, I whispered something. I don't remember what. Maybe it was her name, maybe it was just a breath. And then I turned, lit the lamp, let the light swing wide. Later, I returned to the window, now dark, and saw only my reflection. Older, still, holding something unnamed. But behind that reflection, if I squinted, a star, just one, rising quiet in the west. And I let it rise in me too, not as an answer, but as a way of saying yes. For now, yours, Elliot. Chapter 23, The Ink That Wouldn't Dry. The morning began with a breeze sharp enough to bite, not cruel, but crisp, like it had something to say and wanted you to wake up to hear it. I opened the shutters, let the light in, and lit the fire. The kettle followed. My hands, stiff from sleep, moved with slow familiarity. I had planned to write. Not a letter, not a log, something else. I didn't yet know what it was, only that it was waiting to be written. I pulled out the small, leather-bound journal I kept hidden beneath the drawer in the desk, blank save for a date I'd penned weeks ago. I placed it on the table beside the fire. The light was right. The silence was soft. The pen was one I trusted, a brass-nibbed relic from decades ago. It fit in my hand like an old friend. I dipped it into the inkwell and began. The words came quickly at first. A stream without stones. They weren't profound or poetic, just honest. What I had seen the day before, a thought I hadn't spoken aloud, a dream I remembered too clearly. Then halfway through a sentence, the pen slowed. The ink stuttered, blotted, refused to settle. I paused, waited, tried again. The ink wouldn't dry. I tilted the page toward the fire, watched as the letters shone wet and uncertain. A sentence suspended, unfinished. Even the dots of my eyes glistened like dew. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Still, it remained wet. I tested the ink on a scrap of old paper. It dried quickly. I tried another journal. It too absorbed the ink like any other day. But this page, this one single page, rejected it. I set the pen down. There are moments in a lighthouse keeper's life that defy repair. You learn to let certain mysteries live beside you. I left the journal open on the table and stepped outside. The wind had picked up, but not wildly. It moved through the grass like fingers through hair. The gulls flew low. The horizon was a thin line of steel. I walked to the shore, letting the unfinished sentence follow me like a loose thread. There, near the tide line, I saw a scattering of ink-dark stones, round and gleaming. As I bent to touch one, a sudden memory surfaced. Not visual, not specific, but sensory. A sound, a voice. My own, years ago, whispering a sentence I had never written down. Some truths refused to be captured. I stood there for a long time, then returned to the lighthouse. The journal was still open, the words still wet. But something had shifted. The ink shimmered less. It had begun to settle. I didn't finish the sentence. Instead, I turned the page and wrote, "Let what resists be part of the story." Then closed the journal, let it rest, and watched as the light coming through the window caught the edge of the page and held it, gently, like a breath not quite ready to be released. Gracefully. Yours, Elliot. Chapter 24. Where the light fell differently. There are days when everything feels shifted by 1 degree, not dramatically, not in the way that startles, but subtly, like a chair moved slightly out of place or a favorite mug resting on the wrong shelf. The sort of change that makes you pause without knowing why. Today was like that. The wind was from the southeast instead of the usual west. The tide arrived early. The birdsong came from different branches. And the light. The light fell differently. Inside the lighthouse, it filtered through the upper window at a new angle. It stretched across the wooden floorboards in long, soft streaks, illuminating corners that normally held to shadow. Dust rose in slow spirals, caught in a quiet kind of dance. I followed it, not with intention, just with curiosity. The beam of sunlight had landed on a spot beneath the stairs, a place I seldom looked. There, barely visible until now, was a small wooden box. It wasn't locked or hidden, just forgotten. I knelt and opened it. Inside were papers, a handful of letters, a few photographs, and a bundle of notes written in pencil on aged stationery. I lifted one gently. The edges were brittle, but the handwriting was clear, elegant cursive shaped by steady hands. The letter began simply, "To the one who comes after." My breath caught. I read slowly. The writer spoke not of dates or tasks, but of feelings, of what it meant to live in this place, of learning the rhythms of fog and silence, of the odd comfort that came from storms, of the ache that sometimes arrived without warning, and the joy that followed unexpectedly after. I found a different kind of truth here, one line read, not in answers, but in the permission to be without them. I set the letter down and looked through the others. Some were signed only with initials, others not at all. It became clear they had been left by keepers before me, each one offering something small, not instructions, not stories, just moments, truths too quiet to speak aloud but too tender to discard. I sat with them for a long time. The room was still but alive. The light shifted again, slowly moving off the box and onto the wall, where it lit the framed drawing of the original tower, the one that stood before this one, long gone to fire and tide. I had never noticed the detail before. In the corner, a figure drawn in outline, alone, standing beside the sea. That evening, I carried the letters upstairs. After lighting the lamp and watching it turn, I laid them out across the floor of the tower, each one catching a sliver of the sweeping light. I didn't read them again. I just let them be seen. Sometimes it is not our job to carry the whole story. Sometimes it is enough to hold the fragments up to the light. I left the letters where they were until the final sweep passed over them, then gathered them back into the box, returned it to its place. And as I descended the stairs, the light followed me, still different, still changing, but warm. Yours, for now. Elliot. Chapter 24. The drawer that opened itself. There are sounds a lighthouse makes that become part of your body. The sigh of wind past the tower, the slow moan of shifting wood, the rhythm of your own boots on the spiral stair. And then there are sounds that don't belong. It was late afternoon. The sea was calm. I had just returned from a walk to the southern bluff, where I'd watched the seals gathered like ink blots on the rocks. I was putting my coat away when I heard it, a soft thud like a drawer opening on its own. I paused. No breeze, no movement in the house. I followed the sound. It had come from the small writing desk in the corner of the bedroom, a desk I rarely used, not because it lacked purpose, but because it had always felt like it belonged to someone else, perhaps a former keeper long gone whose touch still lingered in its grain. One of the narrow drawers was open, just an inch. I hadn't touched it in months. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it for a long moment. There was no fear in me, only attention, a kind of reverence. The air felt thinner, charged with something I couldn't name. I pulled the drawer open. Inside, a folded piece of parchment wrapped in string. I didn't open it right away. I placed it on the desk beside the unlit lamp and made a cup of tea. Sat in the kitchen, letting the steam warm my face, letting the moment arrive fully. Then I returned. The parchment was heavier than I expected, not in weight, but in presence. I untied the string and unfolded the page. It was a list. Handwritten, no title, no introduction. Just a series of statements, numbered, inked in the same looping, deliberate script I had once seen in an old ledger tucked deep in the lighthouse archives. The light must be lit, even if no one is watching. The keeper is never truly alone. Silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of attention. Memory clings to wood, especially where hands have rested. Some doors open without keys. The sea is listening. What is lost here is never truly gone. Dreams can be stored in stone. There is no such thing as an empty room. When the drawer opens, it is time. I read the list 3 times. By the 4th, something in me had changed. I didn't try to explain it. I didn't wonder who had written it. I didn't ask why the drawer had chosen that day, that hour. I folded the parchment and placed it back where I had found it. Closed the drawer. But not all the way. Some part of me knew it might need to open again. I lit the lamp early that evening. Not because it was dark, but because I wanted the light to arrive before the night did. I stood beside it longer than usual, watching its slow rotation, its gentle sweep across a sea that seemed, now, to be holding 1,000 untold stories just beneath its surface. Later, I passed the bedroom and paused by the desk. The drawer remained still. But in the corner of the room, near the window facing the eastern sky, a thin line of light had appeared on the floor. Not moonlight, not sun, just light. As if something invisible had stepped forward, just far enough to let me know it was there. And I nodded. Once, in gratitude, and then turned away and let it stay in peace. Yours, Elliot. Chapter 25. When the light stayed lit. It began like any other evening. The sea breathed in long, low waves. The gulls had already vanished into their cliffside hollows. The kettle steamed, the pages of the logbook lay open, and the sky began its slow undressing into twilight. I climbed the tower, lantern in hand. The familiar ascent. My boots met the worn stone steps like they always had. But something in me knew without knowing why, that this would be different. I tended the lamp, cleaned the lens, checked the oil, lit the wick. The flame caught, bloomed, took hold like always. But this time it didn't rotate, it didn't sweep, the mirrors did not turn. And yet the light remained, steady, brilliant, still. It did not need to move. It reached further than I had ever seen, out beyond the curve of the sea, beyond the farthest ships, beyond even the dark itself. I stood there, stunned by its presence. It was no longer a signal. It was something else entirely. It was a remembering, a returning. And in its glow, everything quieted. The tower no longer creaked. The wind no longer pulled. The past and future folded into one wide breath. I sat down beside it. No need to adjust, no tending required. The flame had become something self-sustained. A light that did not demand effort. A light that did not ask to be seen, only to be. And in its being, it changed everything. Memories passed through me, not in images, but in sensation. The warmth of my mother's hands. The sound of a name once whispered against my ear. The weight of sorrow that even now softened under this glow. I did not cry. There was no need. I had already been forgiven for everything I thought I needed to fix, for every silence I could not fill, for every night I thought no one was watching. I stayed there until the sky turned black and then began to silver again. A whole night passed, and still the light burned, gentle, unwavering. At dawn I opened every window in the house. Let the morning in, let the sea speak, let the wind carry the warmth out over the cliffs. And then I descended the stairs, not as keeper, but as something lighter. I brewed a final cup of tea, sat in the chair by the fire, and listened, not for anything, just because, just to listen, just to be. The light stayed lit, even when I no longer tended it, even when the hands on the clock slowed, even when the sea called out in a voice I finally understood. I had done what I came to do. I had watched, I had remembered. I had kept the light, and now the light keeps me. In light, yours, Elliot. Chapter 26. The keeper's chair. It remains, even now with no boots by the door, no mug cooling on the table, no light footsteps climbing the tower. The chair sits by the hearth, angled just so, toward the sea, toward the western window, toward the place the sun always left last. The room carries the scent of quiet things, old paper, salt, cedar smoke, and wool. The kind of scent that doesn't cling but settles. The kind that says someone lived here, and something still does. On the shelf, the driftwood remains, the sea glass, the bone button, the map with no legend, the letter with no name, all the offerings once found, all the pieces never understood but somehow kept. The lamp still turns. Night after night without interruption, the flame steady, the beam wide. No hand tends it now, but it never fails, as if the act of care has become its own rhythm, no longer dependent, but embedded. The journal remains open to a page that ends mid-sentence, a sentence that doesn't need an ending. The seals still gather on the rocks. The gulls still cry over the bluffs. The tide still moves in its old sacred breath. And sometimes when the wind curves just right, the faintest sound rises from the spiral stair. A boot, a pause, a breath. Not haunting, not memory, just presence. The kind that does not seek attention. Only witness. Visitors arrive now and then. They find their way by instinct or accident. never quite knowing what drew them here. Some stay for a night, others linger longer. A few leave with their hearts changed and do not understand why. They speak softly within these walls, as though entering a chapel. They sit in the chair by the fire, they touch the map, they turn the pages of the logbook with reverence. They say it feels as if someone just stood up. Perhaps someone did. Or perhaps the chair was never truly empty. Because the light keeps watch. Because the sea keeps speaking. Because the keeper became the keeping itself, and nothing is lost, and everything remains. The final drawer stays open just a little. The western window glows just before dusk. The lamp burns, not with duty, but with knowing. And somewhere, beneath the hush of wind and the turn of stars, the keeper's chair holds the shape of someone who once sat for a very long time and never really left. Gracefully yours, Eliot. Chapter 27. The Light Beyond the Light. They say every story ends. But some stories don't end, they dissolve. Not into silence, but into presence. Not into darkness, but into a kind of brightness too gentle to name. It had been years. Or perhaps it had been a moment. Time in this place no longer measured itself in clocks. It lived in the tide, in the soft breath of mist curling around the stones, in the glimmer of light across sea glass half buried in sand. The lamp still burns, not because it must, but because it knows how. There are no more logs to write, no more pages to turn. Everything that needed saying has been said, everything that needed holding has been held, and still the story does not end. Some nights when the fog is thick and the air carries a stillness too sacred for words, the light doesn't just sweep across the water, it opens something. A space between memory and now, between seen and unseen. Between those who remain and those who were never gone. The lighthouse becomes more than stone and lamp. It becomes a gate, a breath between breaths, a reminder. Some say they see a figure in the window just as the sun sinks. A silhouette seated near the hearth, or walking the cliffside path, or standing in the tower's glow. They blink. It's gone, but something stays with them. A wordless warmth, a calm, the kind of quiet that softens the hard places in a person. The kind of light that finds you even when you didn't know you were looking. They leave different. Not in ways they can explain, just steadier, more whole. And far out on the water, ships pass through the beam and slow, if only for a moment, as if listening, as if remembering. The light beyond the light reaches them. Just enough, just always, and somewhere, without fanfare or witness, a chair remains by the fire. The drawer stays slightly ajar. The letter stays unread. The tea never quite cools. The lamp never goes out. And the keeper has become the light, still turning, still watching, still welcoming all who come home by way of the sea. No ending, only return. Forever yours, Eliot. Chapter 28. The Light Beyond the Light. It began with a silence so deep I mistook it for absence. But absence implies something missing, and this was not that. This was presence. A presence so complete it needed no movement, no sound, only stillness. It arrived not with fanfare, but with the shift of dust in sunlight, with the soft click of wood cooling after fire. A settling, a breath held and then released, not with urgency, but with trust. The lighthouse stood as it always had. But something had changed. It wasn't in the walls or the lens or the journals resting in their quiet drawer. It was in the space between those things, the space we rarely speak of, the space where meaning grows. I woke that morning with no name in my mouth, no plan in my bones. I moved through the house like smoke, made tea, lit the fire, but everything felt different, not distant, just whole. The chair by the hearth was warm, though I hadn't sat in it. The lamp above hadn't been lit, and yet the room glowed. I looked out the western window and saw the sea. Only it wasn't just sea. It shimmered, not with light from the sky, but with a kind of memory. A memory not my own, but somehow mine. The horizon had widened, not in shape, but in invitation. It was no longer a line. It was a doorway. I stood. The kettle had not boiled, but I no longer needed the tea. I walked slowly through the rooms, touching each thing as if for the first time. And maybe it was. Maybe every moment is a first when seen with clear eyes. The letter with no name had faded to nearly nothing, its words now ghostly, like breath on glass. The driftwood spiral was smooth beneath my fingers. The journal I had left open days ago now held words I didn't remember writing. Some journeys begin only when we realize we have already arrived. I climbed the stairs one final time. But this time it wasn't to light the lamp. The tower welcomed me. Its walls breathed with me. Each step was steady, effortless, as if I were walking up not into height, but into depth. The top chamber was filled with light, but the lamp was unlit. The light had come from somewhere else. It pulsed, not outward, but inward. The sea was gone, or rather, it had become something more. A field of stars, scattered across an ocean of stillness. No waves, no wind, just light. Endless light. And in its center, a shimmer that resembled the tower itself, but made of nothing solid. A form more felt than seen. And I understood. The keeper was never meant to stay. Not because the work was done, but because the work was eternal, and so was I. We do not guard the light, we become it. We do not climb to tend. We rise to remember. And so I stepped forward, not away from the lighthouse, but into it, into what it had always been pointing toward, into the breath between stars, into the silence that is not empty, but full of every word never needed. And the tower turned to mist. The chair, the journal, the driftwood, the shell, the window, the drawer, they all remained. But so did I, just no longer as watcher. Now as the watch, a light that never dims, a hand that never leaves the flame, a breath that continues through every visitor who finds their way to the threshold and wonders why they feel so known. They will sit in the chair. They will trace the spiral. They will open the journal and find a message written in their own hand. They will walk the path to the tower and see that the lamp still burns. And they will not remember how they arrived, only that they have. And the light beyond the light, will hold them, not because they must stay, but because they already belong. And there will be no goodbye. Only yes, yes, yes. The wind will rise again. The gulls will return. The sea will breathe its ancient breath. And somewhere between dusk and dawn, in a lighthouse with no name, the light will turn, not in search, but in song. And the keeper now everywhere will listen, will keep, will be. Forever. Eliot, chapter 29, What the Shore Keeps. After light, after silence, after the breath that became everything, there is still the shore. Not dramatic, not wild, just steady. The place where sea meets land, where endings kiss beginnings, where stories, even after they are told, return to listen. I found myself there, not as keeper, not as memory, but as something softer, a thread in the tide, a pause in the song. The lighthouse still stood, or perhaps it didn't. Perhaps it had folded into the air, into the light, into those who had once kept it. Perhaps it now existed only in the turning of waves and the way a stranger might look up at the stars and feel, for one strange moment, held. I walked the shore barefoot, no coat, no name, only presence. The wind did not push, the sea did not speak, it simply received, and I offered. A button, a shell, a slip of parchment with no words. I placed them gently at the water's edge, not asking them to stay, not willing them to return, just giving them back to what had always held them. Somewhere in the sea, the stories of every watcher, every wanderer, every whisperer of light still moved. Somewhere, the drawer opened. Somewhere, the ink finally dried. Somewhere, the tea stayed warm. And somewhere, someone stood in a quiet room, unsure why they had come, only knowing it was time to sit down. The shore knows. It does not chase, it waits. It receives every wave without question. It lets go of every drop without demand. It remembers without holding, and so must we. I sat at the edge of the world, not looking out, but in. Not seeking meaning, but letting meaning seek me. And it did. In the glint of stone, in the hush of wind, in the shimmer of something unseen resting just beneath the surface. We are not here to master the tides. We are here to learn their music. And in doing so, we remember that we too are rhythm. We are light. We are shoreline. We are the keepers and the kept. And when the last chapter ends, it does not close. It listens. The sea pulls back. The shore waits. And you, the reader, the traveler, the lighthouse keeper in your own becoming, you stand, you breathe, you remember, and you return to your own light, your own silence, your own shore, which never forgot you, not once, not ever. Welcome back. Chapter 30. The sky inside the lens. There is a moment just before the sky breaks into stars, when the entire world holds its breath. That was the moment I returned, not as a keeper, not as memory, but as something light enough to ride that breath, something shaped like a sigh and colored like twilight. The lighthouse no longer needed me, and yet it welcomed me, not with bells or flames or written names, but with stillness, that same beloved stillness, the kind that makes the soul lean forward without moving at all. The tower had changed, or perhaps I had. The stair still curled upward like a question. The windows still caught the sea in their panes. But now, as I climbed, I saw sky, not above me, but within me. Each step didn't take me higher, it took me deeper, into light, into silence, into a knowing too vast to carry in words. At the top, the lens remained. The great glass eye, once turned outward, now opened inward. It held not the sea, not the shore, but the entire sky, not as a reflection, but as its own unfolding. And there, within that lens, was everything. Every keeper who had ever lit a flame, every ship that had passed unseen, every child who dreamed of stars, every widow who stood by the window, every letter written but never sent, every driftwood prayer left at the edge of the world. It was all there, alive, breathing. Still burning, I stepped forward and touched the glass. It shimmered not from light but from welcome. The sky inside the lens was not made of clouds or stars. It was made of remembering. It was made of return. And as I stood there, No longer one, no longer separate, I understood. This was the true flame, not the one I had tended with oil and wick, but the one that burned behind all things, the one that does not flicker, the one that does not need fuel, the one that keeps itself. And in that moment I did not vanish. I became the lens, I became the stare, I became the keeper's chair, the ink that dried, the drawer that opened, the map with no key, the field of stars. I became the stillness that sits behind sound, the light that remains after the flame goes out, the warmth felt even when the fire has burned low, when you, reader, listener, wanderer, you will too, when the path curves, when the page turns, when the lamp flickers in your chest, you will remember this place, not as story, but as home. Because the sky you seek, it was always inside the lens, and the keeper was always you.